Good morning. Good morning. Well, welcome you to the church Bible class, the auditorium Bible class, and those that are live streaming. We're glad that you're on this morning. Couldn't be a more perfect day outside for what is this, March 5th or so? 6th. It couldn't be a better day for March 6th. So we're just really excited about the day, excited about the Bible class, excited about worship. And then I think Mark Taylor will present our program of work for the year. And then we have some evening activities, I think, after worship, don't we, this evening, if I remember correctly. And we are starting a study of the book of Daniel. Now, we're going to go over some familiar territory as we kind of set the stage for Daniel. Of course, we've been talking about, as we studied Ezekiel and Isaiah as well, we've been kind of continuing to review the historical context and the geographic context of this period of time. And as you well remember, Jehoiakim, I think he was about the 8th king of Judah. Jehoiakim was carried away into captivity. And along with the king, there were others that are prominent in the scripture, and Daniel is one of them, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We often refer to them as the three Hebrew children, right? They came with the first wave of captivity. Now, in the larger context, the Assyrian Empire gave way to the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire lasted 70 years, and that was the same period of time that the Jews were in captivity. At least those that wanted to be released from captivity were free to go home, go to the Jerusalem area. But in that era, Nebuchadnezzar, in establishing, after he took over and started the Babylonian Empire, and by the way, he was not the first king of Babylon. There were two that preceded him. So Daniel actually served under about four or five Babylonian kings, and he served 2 or 3 years under the Persian Empire. So Daniel was one of the first people to be captured and taken to Babylon. And he served in the government there for over 70 years, that entire period of captivity, and on into the Persian regime. Now, Jehoiakim, of course, was taken away into captivity, and his son, and let me give a little more context here. Egypt was kind of in control. Egypt was in control of that Palestine area, including, Jerusalem and even Moab and some of those neighboring countries. And Egypt was a threat to Nebuchadnezzar. So, world leaders with egos, what do they want? They want more power, right? They want to be the number one. And so Nebuchadnezzar and the leaders of Egypt were, over a period of several years, fighting in that Palestinian area. They were going at it. Why were they going at it? All it had to do with control. You know, this idea of control is a problem with humankind, right? Everybody wants to be in control. They want to be in control of, the city, the state. They want to be in control of the country. And some people even want to be in control of the world. And so Nebuchadnezzar wanted to be in control of the known world. And so Egypt was a threat to his taking control. And so he had several campaigns, military campaigns, down in that Palestinian area. And so at the same time that he was fighting the Egyptian, fighting control of that area, fighting the Egyptians, he was also raiding Jerusalem. And so there were at least 3 waves of captivity. And Ezekiel, we've been spending some time in Ezekiel, and Ezekiel, he was among those that went in the second wave of captivity. And then the last king of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, who happened to be a puppet king of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar just appointed him to kind of take care of things, but Nebuchadnezzar, of course, was in control. Well, so here Daniel was within the first wave of captivity, Ezekiel in the second wave, and then there was another wave of captivity. And do you suppose there were other prophets and other teachers that were in Babylon besides Daniel and Ezekiel? Do you suppose? Probably. Do we have much of a record of what most of the apostles of Christ did? We have a record of who? Peter? Then, of course, Paul, a later disciple. Well, there may have been God may have been sending dozens of prophets and teachers into the Babylonian captivity. Well, can you imagine a young person, and Daniel would have been a young person when he was carried away into captivity. Can you imagine what it would be like for a few Jewish people, and we know of 4, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. Were there others that were involved in the government of Babylon? Maybe. And in my opinion, probably there were others. But the record left for us doesn't talk about, of course. So Daniel was, and his colleagues, his immediate colleagues, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were probably pretty lonely. Being carried away after a battle that Nebuchadnezzar had against Jerusalem. But for whatever reason, Daniel and at least Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were involved in government. Now, how good's that? You suppose God had anything to do with that? Getting them appointed to, around the government? I suspect God arranged that situation. And there may have been other Jewish young people around government at that particular point in time. Now, Babylon was steeped in idolatry. Some of the archaeologists have uncovered some, remains of temples, and that was an extremely idolatrous society. Now, and Babylon represented the enemy, right? Book of Revelation, Babylon was the enemy. I mean, Babylon was held up as the epitome of evil, the enemy of God, and the enemy of the Jewish people, and ultimately the enemy of the church. That label, they wore the label of evil. Well, I can't imagine being a young person carried away and gotten, under the foreign leadership. But apparently they did make the best of it. Now, if you were a foreign, if you had been Nebuchadnezzar and had these foreigners, and by the way, these were choice young people. They were, royalty. Now, Jerusalem was extremely evil. And apparently there were some people in Jerusalem that were godly and escaped the evil hands of those that were trying to stamp out in the Jewish society Jehovah God. So there, I'm sure there were others in addition to these folks that were godly young people. But it'd be hard to imagine living in that social order. Now, if you were going to matriculate these Jews into your government, what's the first thing you'd want to do?
Get used to your customs.
Pardon me?
Get them used to your customs and ways.
Yeah. You'd want to transition them from the Jewish culture, the Jewish mentality, to the Babylonian mentality. And so one of the first things that they did was to change their names. Now, most people, your name's precious to you, isn't it? I don't know. I wouldn't want to be called anything other than my name, would you? I mean, my name is part of my identity, right? So, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had names that related to Jehovah God, the God of the universe. Now Daniel was given the name of Belshazzar. Say it right. Tell me what it said. Belshazzar. Well, anyway, pretty close. And then each of the his associates were given names that related to the gods of Egypt. I'm sorry, Babylon. So change your name. That was, what do you call that when you try to get somebody? What's the term that's used when you try to kind of conversion therapy? You want to get somebody out of a evil lifestyle. Pardon me? Well, but it's kind of a conversion therapy. get the person to be thinking differently, right? Control the narrative. That's a good way of thinking about it. You control the narrative. You get the person thinking different. You indoctrinate them. And so, change the name. Now, what's in the narrative here? What was the next thing they did in addition to changing their names? Change their diet. Yeah, we're as Americans, we're used to some really American diet, right? Most of us. Now, some people wander off into, Chinese or Mexican and get a taste for that stuff, But when Betty and our son, were in China for a couple of weeks, years and years ago, we just couldn't get used to the rice and the staple diet there. We just couldn't get used to it. We were taking a boat ride, and I saw a turtle. In the morning, I saw a turtle wandering around the kitchen, and they had turtle soup for lunch. I knew that I was not interested in turtle soup, okay? Although some Americans are. Well, when we got back to Hong Kong, we ordered so much that the waitress said, "Are you sure you want this much to eat?" Well, we hadn't had our diet for 2 weeks. We were ready for hamburgers, and we were, chips and that sort of thing. Well, so they wanted to change their diet. But what did Daniel and his companions do about diet?
They wouldn't do it. They asked to stay on the contest.
Yeah. Nebuchadnezzar had this group of people on a particular regimen, a particular diet, and that was a Babylonian diet. Well, what? And apparently there was some part of that diet was in conflict with the law of Moses, with the foods that were accepted by the law of Moses. Apparently there were some foods there that were rejected, and the idea here was to get these people ingrained in the Babylonian culture, the Babylonian philosophy, the Babylonian religion, and then after a period of 3 years, the foreigners being indoctrinated would come before the king, and he'd sort out those that he wanted in his high places, his cabinet, his government. Well, Daniel proposes an interesting test. He proposes that, instead of, being on a diet, this foreign diet for 3 years, he said to the guy in charge of these of this indoctrination, he says, give us 10 days with water and vegetables, and if we don't look, better than the other folks, then I don't know what they'd done I don't know what they'd had to do if they crossing that bridge. But they said, now you and what happened there didn't take 3 years to get them looking good. It took them 10 days. And so they were allowed to be on their Jewish diet for the 3-year period, and there was a good result of that. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, was eventually became the the leader of the world. He stamped out that Egyptian opposition. He stamped out any uprisings. And it's interesting that Daniel, was a part of this government. Now, whereas Ezekiel was out there by the river Kedar, teaching and preaching, we don't have any evidence of Daniel and his companions teaching. Is there anything in the book of Daniel that would indicate that he was trying to make, overtly making converts or even teaching fellow Jews? I haven't seen anything of that nature. But he was important. He was engaged in important work in the government. The book is silent on Jewish affairs. No place in Daniel do we find anything about what was happening in Jerusalem. Nothing there about the pending destruction of Jerusalem or anything that happened after that. What is recorded for us is that it was all about governmental affairs and Babylonian politics. Daniel was involved in Babylonian politics. He was right in the center. He was in the center of power. Now, did that sort of thing happen in previous years among the Jews? Can you think of anybody else that got involved in politics, so to speak, and previously and became a powerful agent? Well, I'm sure you're just too modest to mention it, but that's the reason you're not speaking up. But was not Joseph? Didn't God place Joseph in a powerful position? The most powerful position in Egypt. Subsequent to this, and during the Medo-Persian regime, were there Jews that came to power? God placed Jewish people in power? What about Mordecai? There were people, God put people in prominent positions for his own reasons. We don't know maybe exactly, we don't understand what or why or whatever, but that's the history of the Jews. They were in prominent positions. They came into prominent positions. Now, the book of Daniel itself is divided into two sections. The first 6 chapters or so have to do with the narrative of what was going on in government, in the politics of Babylon, and on into the Medo-Persian regime. And then the rest of the chapter 7 through 12, chapters 7 through 12, relate to to visions and interpretation of those visions. The focus of the whole book, however, is on God as the creator, as the redeemer, and of course his sovereignty controlling the affairs of man. With that background and context, I think we need to, or we will go right into the book itself. And this is pretty much a review of, as we read this, we've talked a lot about chapter 1. In the third year, Daniel chapter 1, first verse, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim. Okay, first we're going to have a wave of captives. Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and he besieged it. Now, he was in that area fighting the Egyptian control. He wanted to control that region, and as we said before. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, that is, in the hand of Babylon, the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God, into Babylon. Now, let's fast forward, and the last king of Babylon was Belshazzar or something like that. I need to get my pronunciation correctly, which I didn't. That was a scene where the last king of Babylon was having a drunken orgy, a drunken thing, and they. What was one of the things they were doing that was really demeaning to the Jews?
Drinking out of utensils from the...
They hauled out the H-A-U-L-E-D, out the vessels from the Jewish vessels from the Jewish temple. Now, the first wave here, they took some of the articles of the temple. Well, when Nebuchadnezzar finally destroyed and burned, tore down the walls, tore down the temple, they took a lot of the rest of the vessels, and even in some of the structures of the temple, the sea that Solomon had built. He took some of the goods. He made a raid on it, but he wasn't finished. But Nebuchadnezzar was not finished in that area, because there were some people left to be captured, to be controlled, to be let's say attacked. The Moabites, the Edomites, some of those nations that were surrounding Jerusalem, or in that general area of Jerusalem. The king had not subdued those people yet. So every time he came into that region, he took a little more out of Jerusalem and attacked the city until finally he in the third wave of captivity, he really destroyed the city. Let's look at 2 again. And the Lord, verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which carried away in the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury house of his God. It must have been custom when they raided the country or whatever. They took articles and put those articles in placed them in their temples and that were dedicated to their gods. You remember when the Ark of the Covenant was taken by the Philistines back in the days of Eli the prophet? The Ark of the Covenant was captured, and what did the Philistines do with it? Where did they put it? Pardon me? well, they situated it in the temple or the area where their god Dagon was. Pardon me? And so they put it in there when they went back to check on things. What happened to Dagon, the stone god? What his head was severed. He fell over, and his head was severed. His arms were, I don't know. And apparently it was custom for them to take, religious articles from a foreign group and put those religious articles in their own, religious institutions or edifices. And verse 3, and the king spake unto Aspen, as the master of his eunuchs. There, eunuch has various meanings. We don't know what the meaning here was, and sometimes a eunuch was referred to as just an officer. An officer was referred to as a eunuch. In other cases, it was referred to those that had been mutilated sexually by their captors. So and the king spake unto Aspenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. Now, we know of 4 Jewish people that were among this group. There may have been others. It's just, we don't know.
Bill?
Yes.
Back in 2 Kings 20 and verse 18.
2 Kings 20 and verse 18. Tim's going to tell us about that.
Well, if you remember King Hezekiah, he was the one who was told he was going to die, and then he was given 15 more years.
Yeah, and Tim is saying that Hezekiah, the king, was a good king. He tried to restore the pure worship, and the prophet came to him and said, get your house in order, you're going to die.
Right.
And so Tim is reminding us that he pleaded with God, and before the prophet had left the premises, right?
Yeah.
He said, well, you're going to have 15 years more.
Right. Well, after he recovered, there was a group from Babylon that came, and he showed them everything in Jerusalem.
That's a great point. During that last 15 years, Hezekiah had an envoy come from Babylon, and I guess in his pride, he showing them, here, look at all this stuff. Look at us. And the prophet came back, and Tim said what?
Well, all this stuff that you've shown them is going to be carried to Babylon. And then he told them, and of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon.
What Tim is mentioning there in the 2 Kings is that what happened here, what was played out with Daniel, was the prophet that was talking to Hezekiah. He said that Babylon was going to take these vessels, and a future son, grandson, great-grandson was going to be carried away, and that some of them would become officers or eunuchs in the foreign government. Okay? Thank you for pointing that out. That's isn't Scripture just so interesting and so convincing? The way prophecies are played out on the page of the future history. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. Now, and then proceeding with verse 4, and let me go back and reread that to keep the context flowing. And the king spake unto Aspen, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. Now, so, this Daniel would have been in that lineage, is that right?
I think so.
Would have had to be because of the prophecy here. Children, and by the way, why would the kings that captured another nation, why would they want to get and keep and preserve, in some cases, preserve the king's children and so forth?
A reminder how powerful they are. They're bowing to them instead of them.
Kathy's saying to remind them of how powerful they are.
Could be a ransom too. I mean, if you come against us, you know what we'll do to your descendants here.
Yeah. Tim says, and it could play as a ransom. But, you know, who in those societies received education? Who in those societies received training, received nurturing? Well, it was the people in power, right? You know, I don't want to digress here, but you know, we're so fortunate that our forebears, forefathers, foremothers, or whatever, however is politically correct there in saying that, they wanted to preserve the concept. They wanted to institute and preserve the concept that every person is an aristocrat. Every person is important and needs to be educated. Now that's free. That isn't going to cost you anything. Children, in verse 4, children in whom was no blemish, well favored, and of course they would have been, the royalty would have been protected, well fed, developed intellectually, and skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge and understanding science, such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace. That is, they would have enough confidence in themselves to stand in the seat of government, to participate in government, and whom they might teach. Now, this is important to understand, that they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. When Moses grew up in the household of Pharaoh, isn't it said in Scripture that he was I'll use the word proficient in the Egyptian culture and so forth. And the tongue. Let me read the last part of that again. I read the whole thing. Children whom was no blemish, but well favored, skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had the ability in them to stand in the king's palace, whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So these Daniel and his associates, they're going to learn a second language here. They might have already known a second language, but they're going to have the Chaldean or the Babylonian Diet. They're going to have the names changed, and now they're going to have a language change. So they've got them they're going to make Chaldeans out of them. They're going to make Babylonians out of these people, they thought. Well, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank. Now, I don't know, maybe they had hog meat there, and the Jews were not allowed to eat swine, I don't know what else, what else would they have that was foreign to the law of Moses. I suppose there's a lot of stuff. Maybe they had an octopus to eat, and the octopus may not have been, on the list, the dietary list. So the king appointed them. The king decided what these people that were being converted, to their culture, what they were going to eat. And this was a 3-year period that somebody was put in charge here of getting these people transferred to the Babylonian thoughts and culture and so on. And then at the end of that period, then the king would interview them and see, I suppose, see if they were going to be loyal. And of course, if the king didn't think they were going to be loyal, well, the king had, all kinds of authority, and you could just have them executed if they weren't, towing the mark as determined by the king. Now, in verse 6, among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Of course, those names were changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel had that Belshazzar name. Verse 7, and to whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Now we got the names changed.
Bill?
Yes.
In my footnotes here, it says that in verse 6, it says that according to the first century Jewish historian Josephus, all 4 of those were part of Zedekiah's royal family.
Ned is saying that according to the historian, the Jewish historian, the renowned Jewish historian, that those, say that again?
Those 4 were part of Zedekiah's royal family.
And that's a reference to another reference to what Tim was saying a while ago, that these people, scholars I think are convinced that they're all together on the fact that these are of royal family, and of course that's what was prophesied. So now we got a name change. We've got we're going to have a diet change. One might wonder. Now Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. One might want to think that might have been intoxicated stuff, and would have been a prohibition. It would have been a prohibition for them to drink that stuff, and therefore he requested the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, did that take any courage? Yeah. You lose your head there. But God was in control here. But these people had to have conviction for God. God to be able to control the situation in their favor. I guess that was the buzzer or the bell or whatever. So we'll begin there with the, let's begin there with the 8th verse next week, okay?